The anecdote that I alluded to is the following. And just bear with me because initially you'll wonder if I've completely lost my mind because it has no apparent connection to what I'm supposed to be talking about. But if you bear with me, it'll make eminent sense. There's a terrific Robert Redford film, and the film is called The Candidate. And it's about this particularly telegenic but utterly vacuous candidate for the presidency of the United States, not unlike our present predicament. But at any rate, he has this campaign, and it's a very telegenic and television-focused campaign, and ultimately he wins. And at the end of the film, Redford turns around to one of his aides and says, "What do we do now?" Well, what's the connection between that and the Indo-Pacific and India and the future of the liberal order? Quite a bit. For decades, in fact, almost entirely during the Cold War, India kept knocking at various global fora, insisting that it be let in. That it needed to have a greater voice in international affairs, in shaping the global order, and that as a country with close to 1 billion people, then now over 1 billion, and a few more now, and as a virtual civilizational entity, that it really needed to have a greater role in global affairs despite its material limitations. And finally, that moment has arrived. And the Indians are scratching their heads and saying, what do we do now? Because they had never anticipated that the moment would arrive when India would actually be called upon to address various global regimes and play a role as a responsible stakeholder in a range of global regimes, whether we are talking about nuclear proliferation, to climate change, to global trade negotiations, or simply upholding this concept of the liberal international order, of a rules-based order. So the Indians are really in a state of panic to some degree because they don't quite know how to respond to the challenges ahead. And yet they recognize that they must find ways to respond appropriately to the demands that are being placed on them. That said, the talk is divided into 3 distinct sections, and I'm going to follow a very time-honored method from my discipline of political science and international relations. First, I'll talk about structural issues. Next, I'll talk about national attributes and capabilities. And finally, I'll conclude by talking about leadership and what that leadership holds for the possibilities of upholding the liberal order in Asia and beyond. India has been generally supportive of a rules-based global order, but it's unsure, and this is where the uncertainty lies, about the extent to which it can actually assume a leadership role. It wants to play that leadership role, but is hesitant to really step forward for a couple of different reasons, which I will talk about. And the first reason is structural. It recognizes that the biggest challenge that it faces, both in the region and beyond, is from the People's Republic of China. This is the dragon that in the room that keeps cropping up. And it recognizes that the PRC probably represents the most significant threat to liberal values and to a liberal order in Asia. But India remains hesitant about stepping forward and confronting the PRC for fear of offending the Northern Colossus. And in considerable part, this fear stems from a growing asymmetry of capabilities. India's military budget is approximately $50 billion. The Chinese military budget, to the extent we can peer through that opacity that characterizes their budget, is about $150 billion. India's GDP is about 1/5 that of the PRC. India is struggling to develop a second aircraft carrier. The PRC is proceeding ahead on that score. So the asymmetries keep getting worse. And India has not devised a military strategy that could enable it to cope with these growing asymmetries that are likely to deepen over the foreseeable future. Consequently, self-help, which is what states do in the international system, is obviously a strategy for India, but an inadequate strategy. So if you cannot engage in self-help, what do? You look for allies, you look for strategic partners. To some degree, India has been doing this for the past decade or so by forging a strategic partnership with the United States, particularly after the principal hurdle in Indo-US relations was removed, namely India's pursuit of a nuclear weapons program outside the ambit of the NPT, and this was a consequence of the 2008 US-India Civilian Nuclear Agreement. But the residue of the Cold War continues to haunt Indian elites, and consequently, a full-scale embrace of the partnership has not emerged. And yet India recognizes, New Delhi recognizes, that the only viable strategic partner that can help it counter the PRC and the PRC's onslaught on the liberal order is the United States. And this is also reflected in India's ambivalence about the degree it wants to invest in the Quad, the quadrilateral naval arrangement involving Japan, Australia, the United States, and India. It's sort of on again and off again, in considerable part driven by the fear of, again, alienating or provoking the PRC. So this is sort of the structural situation that India finds itself in. Let me talk about national capabilities and attributes, which I've already alluded to a little bit. As the world's largest functioning democracy, which just held its national elections recently with a turnout of close to 70% of the eligible population, with over 600 million people exercising their adult franchise, it should be a natural candidate for upholding the working of a rules-based global order. However, as I've already alluded to, it has limited national capabilities as well as important domestic infirmities and is acutely cognizant of these limitations. So there is a significant gap between aspiration and capabilities. And because of this gap, Indians are hesitant about a full-throated support for the liberal order. And in certain areas, the Indians also remain somewhat skeptical about elements of this order, particularly when it comes to, say, for example, the International Criminal Court. Because the fear is that India has enough domestic problems that at some point, one of its members could be indicted before the International Criminal Court, because there have been rampant human rights violations in the suppression of insurgencies, most notably in the disputed state of Jammu and Kashmir. There have been rampant human rights violations, and the fear is at some point India might find itself in the dock. This also explains India's deep ambivalence about the responsibility to protect, because R2P at some point could come to haunt India. It may seem terribly unlikely, but not from the standpoint of Indian elites. Because if powerful states in the international system support R2P, given a breakdown of order and the incapacity of the state to protect its own citizenry, that principle could come to haunt India. And it's particularly a sensitive issue for the current Prime Minister, who presided, frankly, and I will use this word even in an open forum, a pogrom. Because that's what happened in Gujarat in 2002. I recognize I'm going out on a limb, but as to paraphrase the great English writer Somerset Maugham, the only free man is a tenured full professor. If I can't speak truth to power, no one can. So in that spirit, even though I'm being recorded, I said that. So India recognizes the limits of self-help, but is wary of losing its autonomy if it throws in its lot entirely with the United States. More to the point, because of legacy issues harking back to the Cold War, it has misgivings about the reliability of the United States as a strategic partner. After all, the United States has done a complete volte-face when it comes to the People's Republic of China. At one point, it was talking about G2. At one point, Obama went and genuflected before Beijing. And then subsequently, after being mugged in Beijing, he undertook a dramatic turn, a complete about-face. And of course, now China is seen as the principal strategic competitor of the United States in multiple arenas. So given the sort of the vagaries of American policy, the Indians also remain somewhat ill at ease about throwing in their lot with the United States in a completely wholehearted fashion. Finally, to turn to leadership issues, and I promise not to be the typical garrulous academic and exceed my 15 minutes. I will finish on time. Prime Minister Modi, despite domestic illiberalism, and frankly that needs to be underscored, this is not my favorite liberal in any sense of the word. Prime Minister Modi has scant regard for people like me. He has scant regard for journalists who are pesky, who are difficult, who ask awkward questions. He does not like intellectuals. He is a rank populist. Nevertheless, in an ironic way, he represents India's best hope for support for the liberal order, at least globally, not domestically, but globally. Why? Because he sees it in India's interest. It's because he sees India as a potential great power and something that he is passionately committed to making India not just a regional power, but an Asian power. And he recognizes that a rules-based order ultimately is beneficial to India, whether it has to do with trading rules, whether it has to do with the sea lanes of communication, given India's acute dependence on hydrocarbons which come through the sea to India's shores. So for all these reasons, he is committed to the idea of a liberal rules-based order. Furthermore, he has one important advantage over a range of previous prime ministers, and that is he does not suffer from a form of reflexive anti-Americanism and recognizes that the PRC poses the principal threat to the region, and consequently, despite misgivings, India will have to cooperate with the United States. For almost 2 decades, India was considering signing a communication security agreement with the United States, referred to as a foundational agreement. This was finally consummated in 2018 under Modi's watch, after decades of wrangling about it. And that was an important symbolic gesture that we do trust the United States enough so that we can have secure communications and our militaries can work together in concert once this agreement is in place. Previous governments had talked, had engaged in endless palaver about this, but ultimately could not gather the gumption to make this decision. Modi did. It was an important move, both symbolically and substantively. The key issue that Modi will confront, and particularly his new Minister for External Affairs, who's an extraordinarily able Indian diplomat, former foreign secretary, former ambassador to China, former ambassador to the United States. He'd be an asset to anyone's foreign service. The challenge before him will be the mercurial policies of the Trump administration, which could undermine the prospects of cooperation with the Indian leadership. That is the principal uncertainty that India confronts in the foreseeable future. Let me stop on that note. Thank you.